Tree Community Spokane presents our special guest teacher from Sh'ma Yisrael. Join us now as he begins his presentation to our congregation.
Well, blessings, everyone. Shabbat shalom. Good to see you once again. The theme of the day of the season really harkens back to unity, and that Abba's desire is for all of us to be united in cause and purpose and spirit, and in our focus. And all these things belong to him and him alone. And ultimately, our goal is the furtherance of his kingdom. But we can't do it on our own. We have to have a team with us. And we have been set aside to be core representatives of the kingdom of God, both Jew and Gentile, which is really kind of the, additionally speaking, the focus of today, part 2 of my last course, really kind of drilling down a little bit into the perspective of the Jews and towards the non-Jewish community of the first century, how some of the thought processes developed, which I want to kind of get a little bit more into today, and exactly how this revolutionary revealing of the mystery that Shaul refers to as the inclusion of the Gentiles, the nations of the world, into God's redemptive plan, this covenantal plan of forgiveness in the Messiah, would take place, and exactly what Gentiles needed to do in order to be included in this. What did that include? I mean, was it just prayers? Was it circumcision? How far did one have to go in order to be saved? And really, that was part and parcel the question of the day, which was a huge component of the book of Acts, effectively. So I want to kind of jump into that today. I'll share my screen here and we'll get started. Let's see what we have going on here. There we go. So if you remember the last time we talked about the various classes or classifications, I should say, of the peoples of the nations, and to what level they had to reach in order to participate in the various nuances, specifically in Exodus chapter 12, in the participation in the Pesach Seder. So again, it's a very fascinating subject. I'm glad I could discuss this a little bit more with you all. So I want to go back to Rav Shaul, Rabbi Paul's letter to the Ephesians, just kind of do a quick recap here. I'm going to diminish this here so I can actually see. There we go. Bring this down. Sorry, I've got my screen kind of jammed up here. So therefore, remember your former state, you Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcised by those who merely because of an operation on their flesh are called the circumcised. At that time, you had no Messiah. You were estranged from the national life or the commonwealth of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenants embodying God's promise. You were in this world without hope and without God. But now you who were once far off have been brought near through the shedding of the Messiah's blood. You see, the worst thing that one can do is get in front of the kingdom of heaven. We need to be on board with the forward momentum of God's throne as he progresses forward through time immemorial. And the kingdom of heaven advances, as it says, and is often translated, through violence. And the reality is that we cause ourselves undue trauma and undue violence when we get in front of God's movement and in front of his ways. We need to be aboard that throne, that chariot, so to speak, as he travels through the course of time, lest we be run over by those grand fiery wheels of the chariot. So it's critical that we understand this forward momentum and what was taking place during that first century, what caused the trauma in the Jewish lifeblood at the time. Why were there so many requirements laid out in order for the peoples of the nations to be included in this grand process? Why was there so much fear and trepidation? So those are a few things that I'd like to talk about today, but let's jump into it. When we speak of the beginning of Jewish-Gentile relations as far as the believing community and the apostolic scriptures are concerned, we tend to hearken back to none other than Acts chapter 10, which contains two specific versions to two very pivotal figures within the faith. One a Jew and one, of course, a non-Jew. We are speaking of Shimon Kefa, or Simon Peter, and Cornelius, the God-fearing Roman centurion. So as we continue to study, we'll return to the text and look closely at some of the implications connected with these figures. The context of this Acts chapter 10 experience is the appearance of an angel of God to Cornelius at what is called the 9th hour. And of course, today we know that as around the 3 p.m. mark, the time of the Ma'ariv offerings or the prayers of the time. The angel commends the centurion for his prayers and giving of what he calls tzedakah, deeds of righteousness, the giving of alms to the Jewish poor. He is further told that he needs to go and visit a man named Shimon who is staying at a house in Yafo. I love how this next verse is constructed and how the focus of the narrative suddenly shifts. This is Acts chapter 10, verse 9. On the next day, as they were on their way and approaching the city, Shimon went up onto a housetop about the 6th hour to pray. So a couple of things right off the bat. Number one, notice the two approaching fronts in this storm. Cornelius's men, sent on a mission by their master, who has just received an incredible revelation by an angel, a gifting really as a result of his giving alms to the Jewish poor. So what is the reason of him sending these men? Well, we aren't actually told. They aren't told, at least. They're operating completely on faith. Shimon, who is now upon the roof of Shimon the tanner's house at the 6th hour, which is around noon, Mincha, the time of the Mincha or the afternoon sacrifices, is about to receive a little vision of his own. And as we'll see, it is a very timely vision that is intended to prepare him for Cornelius's entourage. So let's read chapter 10 of Acts 10 through 16. But he, Shimon, became hungry and was desiring to eat. But while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance, and he saw the sky opening up and an object like a great sheet coming down, lowered by 4 corners to the ground. And there were in it all kinds of 4-footed animals and crawling creatures of the earth and birds of the air. A voice came to him, "Get up, Shimon, kill and eat." But Shimon said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean." Again, a voice came to him a second time, "Stop treating as unclean what God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the object was sent up. Now, you could teach a 2-hour course plus just about these 6 verses. So I want to just draw your attention to a few little things here before we continue. Notice that Shimon has the chutzpah, like Moshe in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush, who effectively spoke back to God, like Avraham in the book of Breshit, who effectively spoke back to God when he talked about those who would perish in Sodom and Gomorrah and what it would take to assuage the justice of God, right? And Moshe's insistence that he knows exactly the details of God's character so he could accurately portray him to the people of Egypt when he returns, to the people of Israel who were in Egypt when he returns to the land, okay? Note the chutzpah of Shimon as he effectively speaks to God and says, "By no means will I do what you have just said, for I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean." Now, why is that retort so critical to our Messianic Jewish understanding? Because for a very, very, very long time, there has been an attempt to convince us that the early believers, when they came to faith in Yeshua, effectively changed their religion, changed their allegiances, changed their mindset and their process as far as how they portrayed their faith. And somehow they changed their faith structure, no longer anywhere near as identifiable with Israel as it was effectively a new religion, which inevitably became what we call as Christianity. Well, I hate to burst the bubble, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is, with this retort, Shimon establishes that even after he understood that Yeshua was the Messiah of Israel, he never changed the way in which he applied Torah to his life. Because what he effectively states here is, he's telling God, I will not do what you say, because by in so doing, I'm effectively breaking your own rules and regulations that you established through Moses. I will never do so, even if you ask me to, because your word never changes. So by no means, Lord, have I ever eaten anything unholy and unclean. And effectively what he's saying is, I shall never do it now, and I will never do it in the future. So in other words, your ways endure forever. And as a Jew, I will always remain a Jew. Just because I know Yeshua is the Messiah, I will never waver from the idea of clean versus unclean. In other words, I will maintain the laws of kashrut in my life, even though I know Yeshua is the Messiah. So that's critical to our thinking in Shimon's retort back to God. And secondarily, of course, we know that this has nothing to do with sitting down with your Gentile friends and eating ham sandwiches, as I've heard a pastor preach before on the radio many, many years ago. Some would say comical. I say a little bit troublesome, because the reality is, when you read this text in its context, you understand that God is speaking of none other than the nations who were formerly considered unclean, effectively and allegorically here portrayed as four-footed animals, crawling creatures of the earth, considered unclean. Now they are allowed to come in and enter in and worship God in spirit and in truth, along with those who were considered clean through the covenantal promise that God put together through Mount Sinai. So it's very, very critical that you understand these tenets here. Stop treating as unclean what God has made clean. This happened 3 times, and immediately the object was taken up into the sky. So exactly how did Shimon consider the peoples of the nations unclean? Well, it's a very interesting topic, because, as some of you may know, the reality on the ground in Israel towards the peoples of the nations was not always a very friendly one. You have to remember that the nation of Israel was under direct assault and occupation against the people, against the ways of God, by the Roman legions of the day, right? And so to stand in the house of a person who is not Jewish, or even allow a person who is not Jewish into your home, was considered abominable. It was against the laws of the Jewish ideals of the day. So you would effectively cause yourself to become unclean, impure, therefore not allowing you, or preventing you, I should say, from offering sacrifices in the temple, because you would effectively be unclean. And in so being, you would then translate that or transmit that uncleanness to other people that you came in contact with. So this is the level of uncleanness that the Jewish people saw the peoples of the nations of the time. You remember we talked about the 10 degrees of sanctity back in those days, and Yeshua used those words when he spoke to his disciples about entering back into the land. This is how sojourners, when they left the land, they would come back in, they'd have to kick the dust off their feet lest they pollute the land of Israel on that 10th exterior circle of sanctity with the unholy, unclean dust of the nations. He used this metaphorically when he talked about his disciples going to proclaim his messiahship to all the people of Israel. If they don't accept me as the Messiah, if they don't accept your shalom, if they don't accept this good news, consider them effectively no different than the peoples of the nations. Kick the dust off your feet. So this is critical to our understanding as we continue on here. So let's look at Shimon's response here. Actually, Acts chapter 10, verse 22. So it's the Mincha prayer, of course, is about to receive a little vision of his own, as we'll see. It's a very timely vision, and that is intended to prepare him for Cornelius's entourage. So Shimon rises from this trance and receives word that Cornelius's men are downstairs. And after a brief introduction, they said in Acts 10:22, Cornelius, a centurion, a righteous and God-fearing man, well spoken of by the entire nation of the Jews, was divinely directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and hear a message from you. So they lodge with Shimon, and the next day they go to the house of the centurion in Caesarea. And upon their arrival, they are met by the entire family and many close friends. Based on the customs of the time, the city that they were entering, and the context, I'm going to assume that they were all non-Jews. So here comes Shimon, this pious Jew who has never taken in anything unclean or unholy, entering into what would probably have been the most foreign environment that he had ever been to. And he is surrounded by what all Jews at the time would have considered unclean. And as he enters, when Shimon entered, Cornelius met him and fell prostrate at his feet. But Shimon raised him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am just a man." Yet he continues, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unclean or unholy." So when you read the entirety of the context of Acts chapter 10, you realize very, very quickly that God is not talking about the ingesting of food or drink. He's talking about the company that Jews were allowed to keep, where previously they were unable to. Now they are to call these people unclean. They are to be as effectively as Jews to them when they allow them to enter into their home, break bread with them, and that they are allowed to go into the homes of these peoples. And as we'll get into a little bit later, this was a critical component to the beginnings of this embrace between Jew and non-Jew, because everything had to do with the breaking of bread around the table. It's part and parcel when we talk about Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 15. So Shimon was obviously familiar with the customs of Israel and clearly was an active participant in the common understanding and practice regarding non-Jews. The early believers were part of it, the traditional norm within the land. There were various expressions of Judaism, all based on various schools of thought in those days. The Jewish believers operated within the context and in the framework of the recent revelation of Yeshua's messiahship. This revelation, along with the gift of the Ruach, gave birth to what we know of as Haderech, the way. Yochanan in John 14:6a, Yeshua said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No man shall come to the Father but through me." This Haderech, the way, became the movement of the early disciples, founded by the early faithful, which was their unique expression of Jewish practice. If you're looking for a new religion or a complete and total break from the customs of the day, you're not going to find it in the early community, the Gospels, or in the book of Acts. It is a figment of our modern construction, our modern imagination, which has been spawned by centuries of misinformation, misinterpretation, misapplication of context, anti-Semitism, and various what I would call theological fantasies. It simply does not exist within the biblical narrative. It exists only in our minds. And as some would say, our minds can be a very dangerous place. So Cornelius informs Shimon of what took place and what led them to this interaction, and states this, Acts 10:33. So I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. Now then, we are all present here before God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. To which Shimon replies, opening his mouth, Shimon said, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but in every nation, the man who fears him and does what is right is welcome to him. Now, how good of news is that good news? That should be a blessing to you, and as it's been a blessing to people for over 2,000 years now, that this wondrous revelation of God's inclusion of the peoples of the nations is now able to be embraced by people formerly considered unclean, now considered clean, because God is not one to show partiality. What an exciting premise and principle that truly is. Now, one must be careful not to make the mistake that so many have made over the centuries. Do not confuse partiality with distinction. The context here is participation in God's covenantal program and the salvation of all people, both Jews and non-Jews. In regards to salvation, God is indeed impartial. All of us have sinned and fallen short collectively of God's glory. Still, while in this world, God has chosen to maintain a certain distinction amongst peoples, and there are still covenantal roles and practices awaiting their fulfillment within the Jewish people in the final days. Shimon then proclaims the revelation, witness, and testimony of Yeshua to all who are gathered, and with these words, he states, Acts 10:43, of him all the prophets bear witness that through his name, everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness from sin. Wow, that is absolutely powerful. The Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, descended upon the family and friends of Cornelius at that very moment. And what we see is nothing short of what I would consider a Shavuot experience, the first of its kind upon the non-Jewish community. Those who accompanied Shimon on the trek, namely those circumcised, were amazed that that what was once an exclusive club, effectively an exclusive accommodation, exclusive participation, has now been extended to the entirety of this community, to the non-Jews, effectively. The text then concludes that Shimon asking if anyone should refuse mikvah or water immersion for these new non-Jewish disciples into the authority of Yeshua, the Messiah. After all that, how could one object? Of course, we know that no one did. All are immersed, and a new chapter in the body of Messiah begins. But, as history shows us, not all was well. Acts 11:1-3. Now the apostles and the brethren who were throughout Judea heard that the Gentiles also had received the word of God. And when Shimon came up to Jerusalem, the members of the circumcision faction took issue with him, saying, you went into the homes of uncircumcised men and ate with them. Now, can you blame these individuals for making this statement, for taking this position? Of course you couldn't, because that was the norm of the day. And most importantly, these men had not received the revelation that those who were formerly considered unclean now are considered clean, and that God does not show partiality. This was the norm of the day. So again, a natural position and a natural statement for them to make. These people demand an explanation. And as we've spoken about before, it was unlawful to associate with a goy, a person of the nations, and especially unlawful to eat with one. At the base of the argument lay the issue again of purity. It was taught openly and in every school of thought at the time that one would become ritually defiled if coming in contact with non-Jews, and eating with them was utterly unacceptable. In the last class, we went over some of the ways in which the Jewish community viewed the non-Jews of the era. And it was not always a very friendly approach. And again, you have to remember, and as I shared the last time, that the traditions of the day, which we'll get into a little bit more in a bit, they were fences meant to protect the breaking of the commandments, because the nation of Israel knew that the only way to prevent themselves from experiencing another Babylonian type of dispersion is to walk in the ways of God. So they set up protective mechanisms, fences, all of which had to be toppled over before you could break the actual commandments itself. This was drawn out of fear of not only assimilation, but of future dispersions. So you can understand how easy it was to adopt these protective mechanisms in order to prevent a future dispersion into a land that these people did not know. So remember, some of the perspectives that the Jewish people had of Gentiles during that first century: one couldn't sell to Jews. Non-Jews had no share in the world to come. Non-Jews were depraved idolaters. Marrying a Gentile is a capital offense. Entering a non-Jewish resident rendered one ceremonially unclean. We all know these things. It's historical fact, right? So Shimon tells them in sequence of events all that transpired when he was at the rooftop of Shimon the tanner's home in Yaffo, and then in Caesarea when he visited the home of Cornelius. When they heard the amazing power of firsthand testimony from Shimon and that 6 other people had seen the same thing, they were unable to argue any further. And we read this in Acts 11:18. When they heard this, they quieted down and glorified God, saying, well then, God has granted to the Gentiles also the repentance that leads to life. Now, something that you should pick up on here as well, 2 things. I won't get exhaustively into either of them, but 2 things. One, note how quickly the attitude and the position changed of these men. What exactly was this based on? Well, it was based on 2 things. One of them was the reputation of Shimon, who was one of the 12. He was one that saw Yeshua executed. He was one that saw Yeshua rise up and enter into the realm of the unseen, to rise up into the clouds, right? So this was critical testimony. And the testimony of those who walked with Yeshua was held at a much higher level than the testimony of those who were not. Okay, so that's one main principle. And secondarily, it's this idea of the testimony of the witnesses, this oral tradition that is passed on historically in Israel's in the world of the Jewish people, from father to son, from father to son, from father to son, through every single generation. This is why there was such importance and such emphasis based on teaching these things to your children, because effectively what was taking place is we were playing a 1,000-year telephone game from father to son, parents to children, across the board through every generation. This is how the wisdom of God endured through all generations and was passed down to subsequent generations, because you had to speak of it, right? It was orally transmitted to future generations, okay? So this transmission orally of this word coupled with the position that Shimon Kepha, that Simon Peter had in the Jewish community, the believing Jewish community at that time, those two things immediately swayed the position and the statements of these people who were part of the circumcision faction, several of whom were active Pharisees. Well, then, God has granted to the Gentiles also the repentance that leads to life. But still, not all is well in the community, right? Regardless of what's being taught, you have folks who have different takes on biblical interpretation and practice, correct? All right, so let's go to Acts chapter 15. 15 verse 1. But some men came down from Judah to Antioch and began teaching the brothers, you can't be saved unless you undergo circumcision in the manner prescribed by Moshe. Okay, so now we have two diverging streams here, two schools of thought, one of which states that, listen, you can't be saved as a Gentile unless you undergo physical circumcision. It wasn't even enough in this school of thought, this stream of thinking, for you to be simply a God-fearer like Cornelius was. You actually had to become a son of Abraham. In so doing, grown men had to undergo physical circumcision in order to be saved. Women had to go through mikvah, through immersion, offer sacrifices, and then you were considered officially a son and daughter of Abraham. This was one school of thought, right? And now there is a growing momentum of a secondary school of thought in that, no, God does not show partiality, and these people do not have to go undergo circumcision. All they need to do is place their faith in the Messiah, and though they were formerly unclean, now they are considered clean before a God who does not show partiality between men and women. So now it appears that not everyone in the Jerusalem community was convinced by Shimon's oratory in chapter 11. We see in verse 24 of chapter 15 that these men went out from among us without our authorization. Interesting. So some would maybe consider them rabble rousers. Maybe some would consider them a little bit more radicalized, right? You could have an argument either way. I would consider them those who were extremely zealous for the ways and traditions of the Jewish people, of the nation of Israel, and were still operating with this trepidation of future assimilation and trepidation of future diasporas, all of which resulted from the waywardness of the Jewish people and adopting the practices of the peoples of the nations. Because, of course, we know, according to Ezekiel, that God is a jealous God. Okay? So I wouldn't consider that these men, even though they went out technically without authorization, that they were doing anything inherently wrong. They were simply zealous for the ways of God in the way that they understood the ways of God to be and to be applied, right? They just hadn't seen, they hadn't heard, they hadn't experienced the revelation that Shimon experienced, right? So how can you fault someone operating within that specific mind frame? It was the way that things were done back then, okay? So what was this circumcision, okay, in the manner prescribed by Moshe? Well, this we read about here. Boy, my PowerPoint is being a little finicky today. There we go. Leviticus 12:3, on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin, of course, shall be circumcised. This is not a manner per se, okay, but rather a reiteration of what was already described to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. While the written Torah had little to say regarding the explicit practice, the nuances of physical circumcision, the practice of it, the oral Torah made up more than made up for the silence within the text. All we know of historically, according to the scriptures, was that a flint rock of sorts was used, a very sharp rock, which you can only imagine how traumatic that would be for a grown male to undergo. Very, very traumatizing, very, very painful, which is, again, historically speaking, one of the main reasons why the bulk of non-Jewish males maintained a God-fearing status rather than a son of Abraham status. It was simply too painful for the average male to undergo. So that's a really pretty critical historical component for us to kind of lock in. Again, so the written word was very limited in its application. So oral traditions developed over the years as to how to properly practice this act, right? So while we're not going to get heavy into the makeup of and the differences between the oral and the written Torah or traditions, we need to have at least a basic understanding of their relationship during this time and for this particular subject matter. For quite some time during Yeshua's day, and most certainly during his, before Yeshua's day, and most certainly during his day, existed the concept of two Torahs, as we know. So let's look at this briefly. The Torah Sheba'al Peh is the oral tradition believed to have been given orally to Moses by God at Mount Sinai. Moses passed it onto the 70 elders who dispensed it to the people. So to be a little bit more specific, it was given by God to Moses via the agency of angels, which actually Rabbi Paul attests to in one of his letters when he states that through angels, the word of God was given to Moses. So, and subsequently given to the nation of Israel. So that was an oral premise that in all likelihood under Gamliel, Rav Shaul understood, because that's not explicitly stated in the scriptures, though again, Rabbi Paul reiterates it as a matter of fact. So the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, believed to have been given orally to Moses by God. The second, of course, we have the Torah Shebichtav, the Torah as we have it today by the mouth of Adonai through the hand of Moses. And both of those, of course, we know became one. So over the many years, and I'm talking about the context of this first century, the oral Torah had become so intertwined with the interpretation and application of the written Torah that the two became nearly indistinguishable, most certainly inseparable from one another. The two were synonymous in their authoritative scope and were ultimately seen as the main instructive body to the nation of Israel at the time. So again, a very fascinating idea that's very, very critical to our understanding. Now, based on our last teaching, we saw that while circumcision was required for those choosing to become full proselytes, that most rabbis of the day required for non-Jewish inclusion to the community and consequently into the world to come was observance of the Noahide laws. This militant view seen in the first portion of Acts clearly goes beyond what God required, even through the rabbis of the time during this first century experience. This required of non-Jews in the Tanakh as far as their salvation was concerned. It also seems to go beyond what many of the rabbis were teaching at the time, and certainly goes beyond what Shaul and Barnabas were teaching. So Shaul and Barnabas get to Jerusalem as fast as they can, because this was a matter of great urgency. The bulk of non-Jews associated with the God of Israel and his people were those known as God-fearers, of course. They were already observing the Noahide laws. They had a Shabbat observance, a Shabbat discipleship, so to speak. They were praying at the appointed times, as we saw in Acts chapter 10 with Cornelius. And they were likewise required to maintain a synagogue discipleship of sorts. As David Stern noted, thus the requirement that Gentiles convert to Judaism and the teaching behind this requirement constituted a serious threat to the good news and its forward momentum in the day. For if individuals not born into Jewish culture and society are each required effectively to become Jews before God will recognize their faith in him, far fewer will trouble themselves to accept the good news of Yeshua. So you can see how quickly this could become an impediment to the forward momentum of God's kingdom on earth. So can a non-Jew be saved without being physically circumcised? This is the essence of the Acts chapter 15 discussion and the text, which culminates into what we know of as the Jerusalem Council. So let's continue on in the text. Acts 15, 4-5. When they arrived at Jerusalem, they were received by the Messianic community, including the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, "It is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe the Torah of Moses." Again, it's critical for us to understand a couple of things here. Number one, that there were those who maintained their allegiance to Pharisaical concepts, construct, and practice, even after they believed Yeshua was the Messiah. There was nothing inherently wrong with this, because as Yeshua proclaimed to his disciples, do this, but also do that, right? Remember that in two instances, Paul, in the book of Acts and in the book of Philippians, refers to himself in the present tense as an active Pharisee. So he never left this. He didn't turn his back on the traditions that he was taught by Gamaliel. He simply had now a much much more expansive view of the kingdom of heaven, of course, fulfilled in none other than Yeshua, the Messiah. So you can't fault these individuals because this is all that they knew. They grew up in this. And you remember that this was all designed to protect the nation of Israel from assimilation, which historically and inevitably led to their diaspora, okay? It is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe the Torah of Moses. So can you see how easy it is to develop a mindset that the Torah is some negative, overbearing burden, right? So let's read this here. So, sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself here. Acts 15, 7-10. After there was much debate, because these were powerful words, Shimon stood up and said to them, "Brethren, you know that in the early days, God made a choice among you that by my mouth, the Gentiles would hear the word of the good news and believe. And God, who knows the heart, testified to them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he also did to us. He made no difference between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith. Now, therefore, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?" And again, theologies have been developed with this as a central principle. Books have been written about this text of the book of Acts, chapter 15. So several things to discuss here, neither of which do we have the time to get heavily into, but it's critical that you understand here that the context of this. First, and he made no difference between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith. There are people today who will use that, just like they use the vision of the descending sheet with the unclean animals, to say, oh, God has developed new ways. We are no longer beholden to the ancient ways. We are progressing. We are moving forward, right? The Torah tablets are behind us, and we are walking linearly towards the age of grace and the age of the cross, right? Because now there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles. But you remember that there is also the following statement that there is no difference between male and female. Well, the reality is that we know most certainly that there is a difference between male and female, although today the adversary would like us to believe in today's modern culture that there is not. But the reality is that there is indeed a difference between male and female, as we obviously know. So it's clear and obvious that there is still differences between Jew and Gentile, but not when it comes to the context at heart, which is, of course, salvation, God's acceptance of people, okay, based on their faith. That is the context of many of Paul's letters, his overall salvation emphasis, and of course, Shimon Kephas, Simon Peter's as well. When it comes to salvation and God's acceptance of us as pure vessels before him, there is no difference between us and them, okay? And secondarily, now, therefore, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? So now, can you see how easy it is to develop this negative perspective of this overarching, overbearing burden of the Torah? You can begin to understand why so much of the body of the Messiah sees as nothing more, the Torah as nothing more than a legalistic set of rules. It's easy to do when one doesn't understand that two Torahs existed and that the traditions of men, the oral interpretation, was on equal par as far as its value and its authoritative scope, and at times more adhered to than the written Torah itself. And that remains true to this very day. Did Shimon, as an observant Jew, think that the Torah was a burden? An unnecessary yoke and burden, too heavy a burden for the average Jew to bear? May it never be. It couldn't be further from the truth. Again, it depends on how one defines Torah. Did Yaakov, James, Yeshua's brother, think that the Torah was a drudgery? He writes an entire book, an entire letter based upon the merits of Torah observance. Again, may it never be. Can you imagine David waking up in the morning and declaring in Psalm 119:77 that your Torah is a yoke that neither my fathers nor I have been able to bear? It just doesn't have the same psalm ring to it, does it? What he does state is that your Torah is a delight. So is it possible that we have somehow misunderstood not only the purpose of the Torah, but what constitutes Torah in the first place? Shimon appears to be calling the wonderful gift of Torah a burdensome yoke that Jews considered unbearable. But he is not speaking of the Torah of God. The Torah that Shaul refers later to as holy and good. He is speaking of the man-made system that had emerged and elevated by many of the leaders into a rigid set of legalistic rules, and many times trumping in authoritative scope the written words of God himself. Does that mean that all the oral laws, all the oral traditions were somehow bad? Of course. May it never be. Yeshua distinctly said to his disciples, do this, but also do that. So it's critical for us to have a very healthy, balanced, contextual perspective of the differentiation between the Torahs of the day, okay? Just like David said that the Torah is holy, it's the love of his life, it's like honey to my tongue. Just like Shaul said the Torah is good and holy. Just like Yeshua's own brother said that, wrote an entire letter talking about the beauty and the merits of Torah observance, that you show me your faith, your faith without works, I'll show you my faith by my works. Okay? The Torah was holy and good and beautiful, like honey to the tongue. So what exactly are we talking about when he's referring to the yoke that has been placed on the disciples that neither us or our fathers to bear? Well, we're starting to understand now the differences. It's all in the scope of its authoritative application. What position do these Torahs have in the life of the Jewish people? Okay, it's got to be imbalanced. And if one skews the other, we're already going in the wrong direction. Because remember that the yoke that was unable to be born was bred from fear. Fear from future assimilation, which would inevitably result in future diasporas. This is why these yoke principles were placed upon the neck of the nation of Israel as a protective, fear-based mechanism to prevent future punishment. So again, you can't help but understand the position of the people because they hadn't received the revelation yet. Okay, it's critical for us to understand that. Yeshua himself comments on the issue when he confronts certain leaders in Matthew chapter 23. One through 4. Do what they say, but then Yeshua addressed the crowds and his disciples, and he said, the Torah teachers and the Prushim sit in the seat of Moshe. So whatever they tell you, take care to do it. But don't do what they actually do, because they talk about it, but they don't act upon it. They tie heavy loads onto the people's shoulders, but won't lift a finger to help carry them. So again, a further elaboration on the context of this two Torah application and understanding as far as its authoritative scope in the lives of the average Jew at the time. Okay, Yeshua also talks about this idea of this yokish burden as though we were livestock plowing a field with this yoke upon our shoulders, and we're being just whipped and nagged, and we're just trudging through the sun, through this soil, and doing this work, and it's so difficult, right? Because this is how it was projected at the time. And everybody understood in the believing community, well, maybe not everybody, but Yeshua certainly did. And there were people that did. And subsequently, we know that Shimon refers to it as that, listen, how can we draw thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people? How can we continue to this momentum of the forward progress of the kingdom of heaven if we insist on placing a heavy burden and effectively treating all these new believers like livestock plowing a field? It just isn't possible to do so, and it's not sustainable. Okay, so you have to understand again the differentiation in the application and the authoritative scope of these Torahs at the time, and how easy it is through fear to blur the lines between oral and written. And as I said, the same applies today. So what exactly was this yoke that Yeshua was referring to? In contrast to his own yoke, again, this is Matthew 11:29 through 30. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my yoke is light. So what was this yoke that Yeshua exactly is referring to? And in what way is it comparably easier? And in what way is it comparably lighter? Because as believers, we recognize and we know that bearing the yoke of the kingdom of heaven is not really easy to do. To take the burden of the execution stake of the Messiah upon our shoulder is not exactly a light feat, correct? Walking in the principles and the yoke of the kingdom of heaven is actually one of the most difficult things to do, because we travel a narrow road, whereas the way that seems right to a man, that 6-lane Los Angeles freeway, is actually the path that leads to death, and it's traveled by the bulk of humanity. So what exactly about the yoke is easy compared to what was considered the yoke of Torah principles in contrast here? And in what way is the yoke of Yeshua, what exactly, first of all, does it mean? And in what way is it lighter? It's a very fascinating conversation here. So so considering the fact that he came to free the bound and relieve us of our burdens, it seems to be the very opposite of what the Torah, at least according to Shimon, had become. This burdensome thing where people are effectively treated like cattle plowing a field, right? In the sun. Very difficult, an arduous journey. Yeshua is saying he is the Torah of truth. He was the Torah of truth. He was the Torah of freedom. He was the Torah fulfilled. He encapsulated all the foreshadowings and embodied in himself the totality of all that the Torah was, is, and is to be. He was the Torah of freedom, the perfect Torah. He was the fullness of the kingdom of heaven, and through him, life could be found. So what exactly was a yoke? And were there more than one? So let's continue. What constituted a yoke in the first century? The sages referred to them as the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, the yoke of the Torah, the yoke of the commandments. In Shavuot 13a, we read, for all the transgressions of the Torah, whether he repented or not, the day of atonement brings atonement, except in the case of one who throws off the yoke, perverts the teachings of the Torah, and rejects the covenant in the flesh. For the sages, the metaphor yoke was one of willing submission to the Torah and ultimately to the entirety of God's rule over one's life. Okay, so you can see, again, hearkening back to Shavuot 13a, whether he repented or not, the day of atonement brings atonement, except in the case that one willfully, purposely, and rebelliously throws off the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, perverts the teachings, and rejects circumcision, effectively denying that he is a person of praise, that he is a believer of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he is a descendant of God's covenantal platform and principles. Okay, so to deny that effectively castigates one to the realm of Sheol, effectively stating they are no longer a child of the living God. They now walk in the ways of the adversary. Okay, so you can start to see the contextual application of this yoke concept now, and it's all encompassing. It's the Torah, it's the commandments, it's the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. It was understood, dependent on the context, in several different ways. But ultimately, what it seems to represent historically, according to Jewish tradition, was submission to God's written and oral word, and ultimately the rule of God as applied back then in its entirety, all the written and the oral combined. Okay? So what exactly was a yoke, and was there more than one? Again, we saw that there are several. The sages saw the yokes as a hierarchy of submission, with all of them inseparably linked to one another. In other words, there didn't exist a yoke buffet, so to speak, where one could simply stroll through the line and pick what was spiritually appetizing for them in that moment or during that day. The yoke of the kingdom of heaven, or submission to and placing upon one's shoulders the sovereignty of the Holy One of Israel. That's the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Taking upon oneself this yoke meant taking upon oneself the obligation to love him, right, with all of your being, and was taught to help excel, and was thought to help excel the fear of heaven. The yoke of the commandments, or in Exodus 25:11, the Midrash Rabbah, the yoke of the Torah, are pretty much synonymous terms that highlight a walking out of your taking upon yourself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. They referred to the totality of halachic observance in all that it encompassed, both oral and written. So this could even be seen in this midrash about the ordering of the morning prayers. Why would the declaration of the Sh'ma be recited before "and it shall be if you hearken to my commandments"? And it was taught in order that one should first receive upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, and then receive upon himself the yoke of the commandments, right? What do we refer it as in the Christian realm, theologically speaking? We talk about justification and sanctification, right? Before this was Christian principle or Christian theology, it was actually rabbinic principle and rabbinic theology. One must first believe in God with his mind, his heart, his soul, and of course, his action, before he could actually take upon himself the sanctification process of following through with actions and words, or actions and commandments. You first must believe, then you are sanctified. Okay, so if you want to talk about justification and sanctification, recognize that it precedes Christian theology by a very, very long time. Okay, notice how Yeshua, so in fact, let's go continue here. Pirkei Avot 3:15, Rav Elazar the Moabite said, "He who profanes the holy things and despises the festivals and shames his associate in public and makes void the covenant of Abraham, our father, and gives interpretations of Torah which are not according to halacha, even though he possesses Torah and good deeds, he has no share in the world that is to come." Again, a beautiful example of justified before one can be sanctified. Okay? So let's continue on here. Now notice how Yeshua uses the idiomatic metaphorical language of the day by using this terminology and directing it to his principles or to his disciples. He affirmed his authority, although Yeshua did not specify as to the type of yoke that was the type of yoke that his was. What was most important was that it was his yoke. Okay, why would he have serious issues with this terminology as applied to his usage of the term? That's a great question, right? I don't believe so. Again, don't confuse Messiah's gentle approach and terminology as an excuse to do whatever it is you want to do. Just because he says it's an easy yoke doesn't mean that we can simply be complacent in our spiritual approach. His yoke most certainly contained all of the above principles, but viewed and practiced correctly through submission to him, and eventually through the power of the coming comforter that we know of course, as the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. So when Shimon refers to the yoke upon the shoulders of the Jewish people as this burdensome thing, It's because it was. But again, why? Remember that there was, in essence, two Torahs in operation at the time. The traditions and the interpretations of men had become so dominant within the culture, so revered, that they not only attained equal status with the written Torah, but the two were now seen as inseparable. Let's continue on. Well, I think I missed a slide here. I think this is a continuation here of this this prior. Let's see where we go with this. Oh, okay. Well, let's read this verse in Amos 9:11 through 2. After this, I will return and I will rebuild the fallen tent of David. I will rebuild its ruins. I will restore it so that the rest of mankind will seek the Lord. That is, all the Goyim who have been called by my name, says Adonai, who is doing these things. And subsequently, Acts 15:18b through 20a, all this has been known for ages. Therefore, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Goyim who are turning to God. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them. And see, this is where things start to get kind of interesting. And let's go to this next segment here, Acts chapter 15, verse 20. So they came to the conclusion that while we don't want to place this overarching burden on all of these effectively infant non-Jewish believers, surely we have to have some parameters in place, right? You have to have rule of law, of course. So that transitions us to Acts chapter 15, verse 20, which we know historically is really a rough draft, okay? The article, the, precedes all of these in the Greek, but doesn't find its way to the English versions, which is very interesting. So let's look at this one by one. Rather than this extensive burden, let's apply these. Number one, abstain from the things polluted by idols. The final letter version in Acts 15:29 states the things sacrificed, or rather offered to idols. Okay, so some of you may know who F.F. Bruce is. He wrote a really great book, The History of the New Testament. I would encourage everyone to read it at some point. It's a great compendium to help you critically understand context of the first century. He says that the Greek word used for polluted and contaminated refers to pollutions resulting from contact to idol worship. So it doesn't have necessarily to do with the transmission through physical touch, but could be tainted by mere association. Undoubtedly, the pagan practices associated with foreign temples is being addressed here. We've talked about halal meats in the past too, and I'm not sure if this is a group that I've discussed that openly because it's quite a vast subject. And of course, halal meats are directly associated with Islam, the bleeding of animals, the difference between, and some will say, well, at least the Muslims are bleeding the animals like the Jewish people did and do. Well, to the contrary, here's the issue, is that these individuals, these imams, these sheiks, and whoever's overseeing these slaughter practices are offering these animals while they're being, albeit correctly, bled out. They're offering these animals and prayers to who they would call Allah, right? So in many ways, of course, we know that principally speaking, halal foods should not be consumed by believers because those are foods that are being offered to idols, to false idols. So every time Leah and I go to the store, Costco especially, we always look at the labels to make sure the food we're consuming is not halal. Similarly, you go to Lebanese restaurants, some of our favorite food, a lot of the lamb, the New Zealand lamb, a lot of the Australian lamb, virtually all of it is halal offered and halal slaughtered. Okay, so you've got to think about these things when you're going out to eat. You got to think about these things when you're purchasing food. Abstain from the things polluted by idols. pagan practices associated with foreign temples is what's effectively being addressed here. Because you remember that the Gentiles of the day, many of whom, especially if they didn't come from, they hadn't adopted the ways of the God-fears, they were part of temple cults all over the land. Ephesus, Galatia, Corinth, these were all areas that were just rife with pagan idolatry, temple cult worship. In fact, it's the stuff of some of Rav Shaul, Rabbi Paul's greatest scathing words would have to do with the moment he turned his back and left and went to Jerusalem or went somewhere else. The people that he just was ended up going right back to their licentious ways and their temple cult worship practices. Okay, so you remember animals were sacrificed to these gods. So in the context of that day, which obviously preceded the time of Islam, you could not partake in food that was sacrificed to these idols because you would be tainted by mere association. Okay, so let's talk number 2. Abstaining from what is called the fornication. All of the sexual practices associated with the pagan rituals of the time, including their temple worship, was outlawed. One could make a case that this was the reiteration of Leviticus chapter 18, but now to non-Jews. In that text, the children of Israel are warned against all sorts of sexual defilements connected with idolatry and are told specifically that if they practice these, their stay in the land would be a brief one. The cursings would commence rather than the blessings of God. Number 3, abstain from what is the things strangled. One was not to eat meat that is strangled. So what exactly is strangled? Meaning meat that has not been butchered properly, allowing the blood to flow out. And in traditional Jewish culture today, not only is the animal bled properly, so to speak, but then you use what's called kosher salt, which is the large granular salt, to secondarily suck up whatever residual blood there is. So that's why kosher Jewish meat is always excessively and sometimes untastily salty, because they use the kosher salt to draw whatever residual blood is there. Again, it's another example of a fence that was put in within normative Judaism to prevent the defiling the commandment itself. Okay, very important to understand that. And number 4, abstain from the blood. The drinking of animals' blood would by nature also be addressed, since it was not only connected with requirement number 3, but played a role in the temple practices of the time. Some have suggested also that it is a metaphor for murder. So not only were animals sacrificed to idols during these cultish, non-Jewish fornication practices, but people would also drink the blood of these animals, doubly and triply defiling themselves. So you have to remember the cult temple culture and context of the time, because some people who read this, when we talk about the blood and the strangling and the fornication, a lot of people in the modern day church go, what in the world were these people involved in? This is sheer insanity. It's the stuff of a fiction show, right? This is just obscene and disgusting and the stuff of all things horrible. But this was the state of the nations of the time. So effectively what's being taught is these are the cursory rules and regulations, the parameters that all non-Jews, regardless of their background, cannot go outside the boundaries of. If you are to be considered a disciple, a believer in Yeshua the Messiah, you shall abstain from things polluted or sacrificed to idols. You shall abstain from the literal consumption of blood, from animals that were strangled, and for these sexually fornicating practices that was often practiced by these cults in the temple cult structure and context of the day. So Of course, we know that this is not practiced nearly as much today as it was in those days, albeit these things still are sadly and unfortunately practiced today to some capacity. I would say to a lesser degree, but I don't think nearly as much do they obviously reflect the level of participation as they did back then today. So think about these things and ask yourself, okay, in what ways am I, as a non-Jewish believer, following through with what was called, albeit in a rough draft, these 4 requirements, and what I would say, these 4 minimum requirements to be considered a disciple of Yeshua, the Messiah, and inherit the land of promise, be saved, and be allowed to participate in God's, the kingdom of heaven on earth. So we see that these are the 4. So while some suggest that these 4 are really just a variant of the 7 Noahide laws, the purpose of them is of greater interest to me. Note that 3 of the 4 have to do with food, and more specifically, the cleanliness and association of food. Not only did Yaakov want non-Jews to flee from their duplicitous, pagan, temple-oriented worship, but he also knew that if any acceptable, sustainable fellowship was to take place between Jews and non-Jews, because you remember, the curtain has now come down between clean and unclean, it would begin at the table during the practice of breaking bread. Everything revolves around the breaking of bread. And if a non-Jew would partake in these practices or serve these tainted products to ritually conscious Jews, not only would this be an incredible stumbling block, but you would be defiling your fellow brother and sister, whether by touch or by mere association. Critical for us to understand the impact of clean and unclean between peoples formerly considered unclean and those who were always considered clean by the act of circumcision, okay? The defiling thereof. This was simply an unacceptable notion to just, even in ignorance, taint your fellow brother and sister, whether through touch or through mere association. Don't forget that it was for reasons such as this that Jews formerly had no fellowship with the peoples of the nations, okay? This is why they were rendered unclean, okay? Because they did not want to become ritually defiled. It's the main reason of resistance to this beautiful love developing fellowship, which took place primarily at the table during the practice of breaking bread. It was fear that they would be rendered ritually impure and thus unable to offer sacrifices at the temple. Okay, critical for us to understand. So these 4 requirements became the bare minimum in order for Jews to establish fellowship and some type of union with non-Jews. How do we know this? Well, let's look at verse 21. For from the earliest times, Moshe has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. So some take the 4 requirements literally in the frame of that's all that Gentiles needed to do, or that's all that they would ever be expected to participate. I tend to differ just a little bit. And the context of Acts chapter 15, verse 21 really hints at the progression that I believe God wanted the peoples of the nations to eventually make as they got educated, as they got to know him better, as they got to know his people better, his sacrifice system better, and everything about Israel's culture better. Start with these 4 main principles, so at the very least you could have table fellowship with Jews and not defile them. For from the earliest times, Moshe had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. Why would he say this? What's the purpose of these words on the tail end of these 4 proclamations? Well, it's very clear from the context that he's telling them it's obvious that in the land of Israel, during this time, the only place that God-fearers would go, that sons of Abraham would go, was where? They would go to the synagogue to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yeah, they didn't always have the same status. Some of them had to sit in the back, right? But they still got to attend and worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was at the synagogues that they learned about Jewish culture. They learned about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They learned about Jewish practices, what you should and shouldn't do. So you start with these cursory 4, some would argue again, based on the 7 Noahide principles, but understand that as you grow and you mature and you attend the synagogue every Shabbat, you understand the words, they soak in like seeds, and the seeds are watered. You eventually progress in your application thereof. Okay, it was just the common, the understood evolution of biblical practice and construct. Okay, this is my interpretation of Acts 15:21. It's an implication that you start with A, but you eventually will, through education and understanding and revelation, graduate to stage B. So remember that the bulk of those who connected with Israel and many of those who were entering into the community were, of course, just like Cornelius and his family. They were considered fearers of God. Okay? They were required to maintain at the very minimum a synagogue identity, a synagogue discipleship of sorts. Okay? So it would only be natural that over time they would continue to learn and want to embrace more and more the covenantal platforms of God. It seemed like a natural progression. Okay? This takes time. And the early believers at the Jerusalem Council understood that this takes time. You first start with milk before you graduate to meat. Let's start with milk. Eventually, because Moses is taught every Shabbat in the synagogue, people will graduate to solid food. That's just the natural progression of life. It's development. 101. Both Jews and non-Jews are saved through faith. The council declared that non-Jews did not have to effectively become Jews in order to receive salvation in Yeshua and be part of God's covenantal community. But a baby eventually grows up into an adult, and one can only eat Gerber baby food for so long. This is a walking out of faith in all its natural progressions, okay? Which is why Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, left it up to the synagogue and the Spirit to lead the non-Jewish faithful accordingly. If you want to eat with me, these 4 requirements, at the very least, need to be followed so that you don't render me or your fellow brothers in the Messiah ritually impure. And of course, I'm talking about the context of the first century, while the temple was still standing. Okay, so I hope that helped shed maybe a little bit more light on your understanding of the time. And these are critical principles for all of us to really grasp and internalize. And it's a very heavy subject matter, but what we know is that our approach is to be without pride and without ego. And our hope is that all people, Jew and Gentile, turn to God in perfect repentance and acknowledge that Yeshua is indeed the way, the truth, and the life. So let us be mindful of these things, that God starts us out with baby food, but eventually grows us up to a plate of meat and potatoes. And no offense to anyone who is vegan or a vegetarian, but I've never met a steak I didn't like unless it's overcooked. And this is where we are at. The natural progression of a biblical walk is to begin with something simple and grow up to something more elaborate, more complex, and more involved, all the while understanding that through the sacrifice and resurrection of Yeshua, this burden or this yoke of the kingdom of heaven is made palatable for us. It's made doable for us through the power of the resurrection and through the power of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you for joining us. For more info about Olive Tree Community, visit olivetreecommunityspokane.com. Join us on Messianic Joy Radio via live365.com for 24/7 Messianic music and teaching, or download the Live 365 app and search for Messianic Joy. To help present our videos to new viewers, please like, share, or leave a comment on this video. If you'd like to receive regular updates on our videos, please subscribe and use the notification bell. Shabbat Shalom.